Good evening. You're watching The Future Talks. My name is Mark Grigorian. My guest today is Sergey Enikolopov, who is in charge of the Clinical Psychology Research Center located in Moscow. The discussion is going to be in Russian. So let's start right away from the following. Right after the war, after any war, the losing party is frustrated. It goes through certain changes psychologically. What is that? What kind of changes they are and how they're called? You know, one thing that unites the winners and losers is that both have post-traumatic stress disorders, which is quite a serious disease, by the way, diagnosed after 1980s, used after 1980s, when the Americans found out that drug addicts, alcoholics, suiciders were mostly veterans of the war. And naturally, some research carried out by the scientists showed that they used to pay attention to that previously, with the syndromes of artillery shooting and syndrome of the boxes and everything. It occurred also in the 19th century after the battles of Selfesteem. But naturally, the loser, as always, improves, recovers longer. The party that loses, it recovers for a longer period of time. So the same situation in Yerevan and Stepanakert in 95. Well, in Yerevan, it was the blockade removed, some electricity finally generated, and I visited Armenia at the time. There were several Russian journalists joining in who were really astonished to see other eyes, they said. People had other eyes, other looks in Stepanakert, the eyes of the winners. Whereas in Yerevan, there were many who essentially don't have those looks. In that respect, I should say, when it is about the current situation in Armenia, we should take into account that the PTSD essentially became stronger. Maybe many do not even have the PTSD as such, but have very similar symptoms. And those are mostly expressed as depression, a depressive background, a depressive state of understanding the environment. Clear. Okay, you know what you just said, quite curiously, is asserted by the fact that for many in Yerevan, in the years of the first war in Karabakh, these years were years of cold and hunger. Yes, the cold and hunger. Yes, those are the years essentially where everything was sacrificed at war, and it was a very difficult victory. But for many people, those years stayed as such, remained the years of cold and hunger. Well, it's not even, I mean, it's just another assertion of the fact. That's how people were divided, and the behavior of people who lived in Karabakh definitely differed from the behavior of those who lived in Yerevan and in Armenia in general. Well, I'm sure that it's different today as well, because everything happening is observed in different ways here and there. Yes, unfortunately, I haven't been neither in Armenia nor in Karabakh recently, and that's why I can't say anything. I cannot say what the difference is, at least. I mean, there is a difference, you may know, in a certain sense. You can see the difference. You can invent the reasons, but you must also understand that in both places, the attitude to a non-healthy psychological state should be very serious. Okay, Sergey Enikolopov, Armenians went through several very, very severe traumas for the last 100 years. That's the genocide first, and that's the several earthquakes happening on Armenian land, the trauma of 1937 and Stalin's repressions. Well, I'm not a big rooter for the USSR, but essentially the collapse of the Soviet Union was another trauma. We should do something about it, shouldn't we? Well, of course, of course. Well, you know, all these traumas you mentioned, they had very clear message produced. But I'd like to say that, and I think that it should also be understood now that after 1915, we had 1918 with the first republic of Armenia, and independently of how people treated that, there are things which are essentially uncontestable. The First Republic was trying to create a state, and the citizens of that state understood that hundreds of years of statelessness, they're going to build their own state. And they were suffering the first years of the Soviet Union as well, because, I mean, it was quite a powerful energy there. Earthquakes, of course, a very strong stress, at least what I have seen myself, because I saw the consequences of the earthquake in Spitak in 1988. But of course, it immediately boosted activity. Build, create, do something. The most modern hospitals were built, the methods of clinical intervention, psychological intervention. Well, I wouldn't say Armenia should be proud of its psychological service, but the services of psychological assistance were established after the earthquake and started operating. So when the war broke out, the foundations were there. There was the stress center established already. People went through some training and were ready to provide services. So, you know, this is like the common problem of all types of stresses, war or earthquake, and you may come out of that condition beneficially only by overcoming the hassles, the difficulties. Some people would overcome their own, some would create something like first years of the First Republic and the first years of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Armenian University and the creation of Armenian intellectuals, intelligentsia as such. So, I mean, people who essentially have earned a lot, people who left their careers in Berlin, Paris, St. Petersburg, and Moscow and returned to Armenia and created the scientific Armenian language that we consider only the narrow spectrum thereof. And in parallel to that, Yerevan HPP was built, irrigation canals all around the country. So, I mean, the country was in a very active period of revival. And in that respect, all ways out from that situation are similar, not only in Armenia, everywhere. Well, Soviet Union underwent a fantastic stress after the Second World War, but there was a very little PTSD there because it was the stress of the winners, and they came back and they continued creating new factories, new industries. so that Armenia had all those as well. So this national enthusiasm is very serious. It allows sometimes for the recovery of the hopeless. Okay, so as far as I understand, well, I don't know. The right way to come out of the stressful situation is to create, right? Yes, creation, exactly. Yes, and by the way, the role of the state is so important here. You see, there has to be an established target, a program. I mean, it's not a reaction to what happens in the world. Something happens somewhere and we react. No. The good example, though, is the COVID situation. Okay, what is being done is done essentially the reaction to COVID-19. Fortunately, there are no populists there to say that they have the magic wind, which would essentially help everyone. But it's just a reaction. We overcome most of the problems by reacting to them somehow. And I've been dealing with the issue for 2 years already, so it's just a reaction. And the reaction to COVID ultimately results in a fatigue. You are emaciated by the different promises to create the magic vaccines, etc. So for a state, for the government that exists in Armenia today, the issue number one is being proactive. They should be able to create on their own instead of reacting to something that happens in the world, something that should not happen overnight, something that has to be recommended, maybe recommended in 1980s in Soviet Union, for example, when there was yet communism. You may laugh at it as long as you wish, but ultimately that program established some social optimism there. People got their confirmations about it in the same year when the Cheromushki district was built after the, next to the bridge, where there were mostly rural communities. The same happened, of course, in Moscow and in other areas. It did not mean everybody moved in immediately, but we all knew people who moved to these new apartments built there, these districts which were built over rural houses. So I will have to cite my own self, unfortunately, but the aggression I've been dealing with for quite a long time, quite actively, is a great indicator of social well-being and non-well-being. In the end of 60s in Moscow, there were only 9% of murders because of money or property, which meant that the murderers did not read papers, did not believe in communism 20 years from there, but the whole atmosphere per se created such preconditions, because there was a short period of drop in the number of suicide cases. Okay, so creation, a program that will create the conducive environment for creation. Not necessarily that program or that strategy should be implemented. Most importantly, it has to establish the positive environment, to give that charge. Yes, it's not just a program. I mean, it's not that you will become devout and appear in paradise after you die. No, the program it has to be a long-term thing. I mean, I don't know how I'm being translated now, but the most important thing is that it's conducive, it's positive, it's long-term, while it clearly points to some positive changes specifically, like tomorrow we will have this, and the day after we're going to have that, so that it's tangible, at least somehow, so people feel like there is a new pole there in the street, and there is a new light there, as they promised. 2 or 3 more, then it's clear towards the target we're moving. I mean, it's clear where we're going when there are lights installed in that direction, one after the other. Oh, you remind me of the story after 1930, when it was clear that we had to break through that very stressful condition. They celebrated the millennium of David of Sassoon epic. Also, the big significance given to the decade of Armenian culture in Moscow in 1939, yes, and then fortified further in 1957, another decade, celebrated in parallel to that, essentially, the building of the city as such. Of course, it started before 1937, but more buildings and streets were built after the war. And people understood, people at that time understood where the architecture of the city was moving towards. You know, there is one very interesting point there. Exactly in that post-war period, there was a number of songs written about Yerevan. And if you read the text, the lyrics, you understand that the city was not there at the time. Like, I was born here and grew up here and drank this water. All right, drank water, cold water, no town, no establishment as such. Yes, the water is yet quite good, by the way. So, you know, all these kind of attributions, meanwhile, were fulfilled with this discourse of a marvelous city, of a beautiful city. Yes, it creates the environment. It creates the environment of the desire to do more with this song of first love. Yes, everyone pays attention to the playwright and musical company there, but it's a propaganda, in fact. Everyone's working on construction sites. It's you can see the new town, the new buildings populating it. So this is apparently one of the most serious problems that occurs all the time. The second is more like narrow, I think, better related to what I do. Well, of course, you have to give a lot of attention to the psychological health. Unfortunately, there are very few countries who understand how important healthy mental capacity is, or mental health is in general. So, I mean, when the question is, what is more important, mental health or cardiology? Well, of course, cardiology is first, or oncology, or etc. I mean, you can touch, you can see, you can feel it. But to have less cardio patients, you should apparently pay attention to the mental health, to the psychological health. Research here and in the West shows that a very big role in overcoming a disease, in preventing a disease, is given to psychology and psycho health. It's not just by chance that it happens more in the West and less in Russia, though more attention is being paid recently, quite seriously. So, and that is related not to the fact that you can just commission some money and build a building. That building is ultimately going to be filled with specialists, right? So it's also an issue of educating professionals for the sector. And that's where you should never expect that they will come from somewhere, but you just create the infrastructure and they will suddenly appear. You can essentially learn the lessons by everyone. You should not expect an American professor to arrive in your country and create everything. Or from France, I don't know. The same in Russia, by the way. So the better way is when they all work together. In that respect, the experience of work during the, during the support provided after the earthquake with all the psychiatrists and psychologists in American Europe, gave a lot to those who are still in Armenia providing the service. You know, yesterday when we were discussing it, kind of a pre-interview discussion we had, this is an ordinary thing. This is what you said, and I remember. You said, the nation should have the high self-esteem. We turned to it because it's very important that self-esteem makes people more tolerant, makes them better, more willing. Well, yes, of course, naturally. We started from a discussion about the post-traumatic stress, but it may be overcome by the self-esteem. The winners, they survive better because self-esteem, not of the whole nation, but of every individual of that nation, of every resident of that territory, is a great capacity. I mean, it allows solving problems, first of all, but it also allows improving the physical condition of the citizens and general comfort of life. Well, yeah, tolerance will come with it, believe me. You know, when you work in research centers, you of course see, yes, they are able to raise the self-esteem. The individual self-esteem will ultimately result in a national one. That's what can be done. But considering all the representatives of your nation lousy, deplorable, is not the best solution either, believe me. So also, it's great when it's bilateral, meaning when you're proud that you are what you are, and meanwhile, you're also proud that you're Armenian. Yes, I see. So several times we have already mentioned, you mentioned, that both the winners and the losers feel the stress. In fact, we can see and understand that the conflict did not start by this war and did not end with it. It continues, and we permanently influence one another. Armenians influencing Azerbaijanis, vice versa. By some, I don't know, ways, we try to compare ourselves to them and put ourselves into that comparison with them, and that's what they do as well. Not only, you know. First of all, we essentially establish and cultivate the persona of the enemy, both in the first war, the second war. The persona of an Azerbaijani person is something which is non-vendible from the Turks, and we had all the signs to assert that in 1915 and in the following years. Also, we're afraid of the genocide occurring again. Yes, and that's natural. Well, it's not a diagnosis, it's a fact. As for Azerbaijanis, indeed, these are the people who don't like us. That's the first association. They're just not simply others as the others, but they're also unique in the sense that they perceive us as their enemies, with the inner fears there as well. So in that respect, unfortunately, the winner and the loser this way or another, are interconnected. For years, it's not just by chance. Lukashenko said the other time that they have to stand, they should kneel before Lukashenko. Germans say that they know that they didn't behave well during the war, but so many years have passed. Why would you bring that up again? Well, it's not that Lukashenko did something good, but it's because this history and historical memory ultimately starts working and creates the concept of the enemy. And by creating that, we essentially put ourselves into this psychology of an ambush. Exactly. We're ambushed from all sides. Exactly. And then we start thinking about other neighbors. We do not think how friendly they are, but we start to think how hostile they may become. Well, it's clear that these are different countries. Turkey, Iran, Georgia, they are differently perceived. Nevertheless, that feeling of being ambushed is being sieged in a fortress exists. We feel like we're being sieged. There are certain components that are simply counterproductive. They hamper any development. So in that respect, there are objections to Armenian intelligentsia because the Armenian intellectuals, thinkers, and the authorities, because Azerbaijan is, for example, they have been very actively, I would even say in an extensive manner, publishing their versions of history in Russian. And it was not so insane as in case of Ukraine, who say that they just created the Black Sea, the ancient Ukurs, but different, stating that Armenians were brought by Griboyedov from Iran. There are visitors here. There were no Armenians in the Caucasus before, etc. It's the beginning of the 19th century where Armenians emerged suddenly, and all the problems Karabakh people complained of were created by Armenians who were members of the Communist Party and worked in the Communist Party of Azerbaijan. Well, something's right, something's wrong. But the shape, the appearance they started to establish about Armenians essentially differed from being a sieged fortress. Why would that conflict ultimately happen? Because that's what they were saying. They were saying, we're peaceful, Armenians are the ones. They were saying that they are old, ancient, and good, and Armenians are aggressive. So I haven't seen that in the history books of Armenia, and recently none is being published. So it turns out that the Russian society in general is not quite ready to accept the Armenian version of the story. All right, we can read any comment. When there is a point saying that this person was Armenian and had his or her contribution to Russian culture, immediately, there will be a counter version of Azerbaijan. And 10, 15 years ago, Armenians won a football match somewhere. And the comments, somewhere on the 10th comment, someone says, yes, they're right. It's an ancient Christian nation. What do Armenian football players have to do with this ancient world? And then they start discussing the Macedonian temples, etc. I mean, why would they ever discuss that in that concept? In that, well, it's the manner they chose to hold such disputes. And I mean, these disputes and the social networks are usually very superficial, very primitive. Yes, well, you know, with all my despise to the disputes in the social media, they are still quite a serious factor because they create the fertile soil for development of any relations in the future. Somewhere I read something, either this guy stole or it was stolen from him, but the sediment is there. I mean, I have a kind of a predilected feeling. Well, the moment when we spoke of the siege psychology and the psychology of a siege fortress, I literally heard the speakers, I'm sorry, the viewers saying that, yes, indeed, we are under siege. Turkey from one side, Azerbaijan from the other, and these old plans of pan-Turkism and Islamism persisting to eliminate, exterminate Armenians. Well, it's a very emotional argument, an argument which is very difficult to react to in the rational, but rather in the emotional field. Well, of course, but, you know, when the first emotional waves slump, then intellectuals start to generate rational ideas about what to do in such situation. You should look for allies. You should look for people in countries, other countries, who do not want that to happen, even though they can be very far. But you should also remember that China does not want to give freedoms to its Turks, and there is a real war going on there. Iran doesn't want stronger Turkey, stronger Turkish nation from the Mediterranean to its borders or to China. Hence, you should start playing in alliances. So you should look for allies by just looking at the world through that prism, through that spectrum. Continue living in a fortress. But it's a one thing when you are in the last fortress and you feel alone. But the second is when there are other fortresses who do not want your enemy triumphant. All right, so we're going back to the idea now that we need to be creative. Well, if I were to say there is no creativity required, I would definitely be quite well reprimanded. Well, of course, you always need creativity. The other thing is that you should incentivize, you should nourish it all the time, should promote it. You must understand that public service is not going to promote creativity. Creativity is promoted by the society, the people who live on the soil, people who invented the plow and agriculture. Let me bring an example here, an ancient one, by the way. In medieval Europe, they used to just burn people or kill people who were left-handed. They would kill lefties simply because they thought they were the devils. But in Armenia, in the museum, I saw plow, especially for those who were left-handed. It's normal, isn't it? So when the farmer should not try to train his right hand to work with the plow in the field. No, everything's been done for the left-handed person to use the plow respectively and cultivate his soil. So it was done somewhere in the 11th century. And we have to be proud of that. We simply need to further promote our creativity. Yes, believe in it and promote it. You should not believe in it even. There are many creative people. A different thing is with the leftists as well. You're at the school, and then they teach you right by your left hand. Better or worse, doesn't matter ultimately. They're going to use some sticks to hit you at the hand when you don't hold the knife or the fork the right way. In this case, you should not disturb them. Let them learn the way they wanted to. So that's what you have to look at. Be very serious about it. You said the current situation, current condition, it contributes to some additional burden for psychologists and psychiatrists. Well, I think that load, that burden grew for other professions as well, like teachers, for example. Well, I spoke about psychiatrists, psychologists first because that's what I do. I can recognize that burden. And doubtlessly, it is on the shoulders of the teachers as well. Well, it falls on the shoulders of anything who can be called, or which can be called, intellectual, because they have to think, and they think. And I mean, it falls on the shoulders of the writers and journalists. At a certain moment, the journalist will understand that he or she will have to ultimately follow the rules of the doctors, meaning cause no harm. You know, during the terroristic acts, the times of terroristic acts in Moscow, some TV channels simply enjoyed the information. Some others were trying to tell about terroristic acts in a way so that they don't traumatize the viewers. These are two completely different attitudes. I mean, you couldn't allow a person cover a terroristic act who's afraid more of the terrorism than the viewers. A very journalistic view I have at the concept of no harm, because that concept of no harm is usually used when they try to hide the information. When covering terroristic acts, journalists have to be quite professional and smart, not to show they may enjoy it. Well, you know, when I say harm, it is not the censored approach here. It's an issue of self-acknowledgement. I mean, it's your censorship. It's the censorship you apply upon your own self, because there can be a journalist who is like physically close in proximity to the place where the terroristic act happened, just rushes there and starts asking questions, essentially being a witness, or maybe trying to show a witness of the terroristic act. It's the same as if you're hearing the host of a football match, the anchor or the person commenting a football match, but that person is just an agronomist, is an agricultural specialist. So I start speaking about the grass that covers the football field, because a good farmer or a good agronomist understands that while commenting on a football match, he should say that the ball was passed from number 7 to number 8. So when saying not harm, I mean the responsibility that professional feels at the moment. That's what I mean. So when a doctor is being taught to do something, then he first of all learns that he should not harm. So my remarks to journalists are not the meanest, I should say. We're not saying change the title and undergo some censorship. Well, most important to me was that you attributed journalists to the people who are forced to think. A very nice statement. Compelled to think, forced to think. I will use it with your permission. Be my guest. But I think so, indeed. There are many professions where you have to think. sometimes, you know, there's this old story, don't think, but shake it, let it work. But a number of different professions where people have to understand that the situation is quite volatile. It's going to change. Journalists, teachers, they have to understand that it's a different boy or girl. Well, a teacher has been teaching for 20 years, but now it's a different child sitting there, a different child from a different time. In this generational shifts essentially compel the most experienced teachers to change. So yes, like what happens in the world now? Very serious problems in Russia, especially the bullying. It turns out teachers do not want, they shut a blind eye on that. The students complain, it exists, teachers avoid it. Well, not all of them. There are some exceptions, but they just shut a blind eye on that. That's what their teachers told them to do. In fact, they are sometimes compelled to see, and they see, but they don't react. That's what I want to say. So I suppose they should be more creative in dealing with bullying. Well, I think that we can end here with your statement that it's desirable to be more creative. Yes, we can end our discussion with that. Just a point to add. Help others become creative. Exactly. My guest today was psychologist Sergey Enikolopov. Thank you, Sergey Nikolaevich. Welcome. Goodbye.